you very much. And a very good morning to everyone. Professor Ravi Narayan Kaur, Principal, Mr. P.K. Mishra, Swami Shamananji, Professor Barai, organizers of this event, Professors Kusha, Ruchika, and Mukta, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. The topic I said I will talk about is about a brief history of Indian theory of governance and economics. I thought this would be an appropriate topic because a lot is said about Indian contributions to Indian intellectual contributions, but very often these contributions, particularly in the area of economics and governance, tend to end up at best as a discussion about Kautilya's Arthashastra at most. And even that is, you get the impression that it is somehow one document that was created in thin air and that there is nothing before it and nothing after that. This is not the case. India actually has a very long and rich tradition of thinking about governance, and I'm going to give you a flavor of this. Forgive me that I'm going to skip a lot because it is an overview, but it will give you a flavor of the deep and interesting thoughts that have happened in this field over very long periods of time. After all, we are the world's oldest living civilization, and we have a long history of kingdoms, republics, and other things that have existed for a long time. So not surprisingly, we thought a lot about prosperity, governance, and these issues. So what I'm going to do is give you a flavor of this. Notice here that this is not a history of architecture of government. So to the extent that this literature, academic literature exists on Indian theory of governance, it tends to go into, how the layers of bureaucracy functioned and so on. Whether something was a republic or it was a kingdom and so on. What I'm going to talk about is about the Indian theory of governance, i.e. what did these people want to achieve, whether they were a republic or a kingdom or had a bureaucracy or had mansabdari system or whatever. What is it that they were trying to achieve? What were the principles they used? That is what I'm going to talk about. Now, let us go right to the beginning of Indian history. So Indian history begins with two separate sources of this knowledge. One is the Vedic texts, and the other is the archaeological remains of the Harappan civilization, or otherwise known as the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. There is now increasing archaeology on the Gangetic plains as well, which goes back to the Bronze Age. So this we now have this huge corpus of information. There is a lot of controversy still there about how all these different branches of information, whether the Vedic texts and the Harappan archaeology are linked to each other. I have very strong views on that. Some of you may be well aware of this. But today I'm not going to get into that because I am going to focus just on the governance part of it. And unfortunately on this, there is relatively little information that you can make up. So for example, if you take the Vedic texts, then what do we know from the Vedic text is that the Vedic tribes were ruled by a chieftain, the Rajan, and that he had to support him a Samiti, which was a grand assembly of the tribe, and a Sabha, which was an executive council. Beyond that, unfortunately, we can't say very much. Now notice, however, that these meanings have switched. Today, Samiti means a small executive council, a committee or something like that, and a Sabha is a grand assembly. But again, even if we today had that information, that we have an executive council and Sabha, it would tell us still nothing about how the actual country was run or those kingdoms were run. And that is basically the situation we have. So we know about the form of government, but nothing about the principles of government. Now, from the Harappan archaeology, we have the opposite problem. We know that there was a lot of emphasis on, for example, municipal issues. We know there was a lot of issues about, they took a lot of interest in standardizing various municipal weights, measures, size of bricks, and so on. But we have no idea how they arrived at this. Uh, we know at best that they had an elite, because almost all the large sites have an upper town which is clearly better constructed. There are larger towns, the larger buildings, dwellings in that upper town, which is very often fortified. But again, other than knowing that there was a elite, we can say nothing about what are the principles they used, what is the basis on which they were doing this governance. We do not know. Now, those who believe that the Vedic civilization coincided with the Harappans, one could argue that these upper town of the Harappans was where the Sabha and the Samiti met. But that's just conjecture. So we really have to move on to the next era to get a better sense of what were people actually thinking about governance. And here we end up in the Iron Age. So here we are moving from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And in the Iron Age, and again, I'm not getting into the debate about dating this at all, because that's not my focus. We end up with two great testimonies of that time. And these are the Itihasas or the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And here we do get fairly more explicit discussions about governance. Particularly, for example, you have the Raj Dharma Parva of the Mahabharata. And there, Bhishma, lying on the bed of arrows, discusses with Yudhishthir the various principles of governance. And similarly, in the Ramayana, for example, in the Balkand in particular, you have descriptions of Dasharath's kingdom and so on. So you have some sense of what these kingdoms thought about, what the kingdoms of the time were, what the principles of governance. But again, it's not a very systematic laying out of principles. They are more in the form of aphorisms and statements. It doesn't say how you arrived at those statements, or what was the framework of thinking by which you came to those conclusions. So we really have to work hard to figure out what their overall understanding of governance was in a second order sense by looking at the concepts that they are talking about. So in the Mahabharata in particular, but also in the Ramayana, one major concept pops up. And that concept is that of Matsya Nyaya. So what is Matsya Nyaya? The Matsya Nyaya is the idea that the big fish eat the small fish. This is like the law of the jungle. And the basic point is that the state or the king needs to exist in order to avoid Matsya Nyaya. So this is a very important core idea that is there in both the epics, that the state exists to avoid Matsya Nyaya. And how do you go about arriving at avoiding Matsya Nyaya? Well, that is done by the state following dharma. Now, of course, the problem is that this word dharma is a very general word. It is used and misused in a variety of ways. And so again, it's very difficult to easily arrive at working out what did they mean by dharma. There are some like Professor Meenakshi Jain who will argue that it was a form of common law system which similar to what is practiced in British colonies, including India, which allowed for contextualized and evolving solutions of governance. So this was not a rigid code like many may think, like the Dharma Shastras. The Dharma Shastras, at least in my view, were at best embodies of enforceable law. At best, they were opinions for reference. So how did they actually rule these kingdoms? Again, we can't really tell this because this is not clearly enunciated. So this is the problem with all the discussions pre-Arthashastra, and that is why very many people end up with discussing the Arthashastra, because you have to work rather hard to work out what these principles were. But if you read both the epics, you do find some interesting insights into how the frameworks of thinking work. So one of the frameworks of thinking that seems to come through, i.e. the basis of dharma in the Ramayana, is all about the enforcement of contracts and promises. So that's why Pran Jai par Bachana na jai, right? So you see in Ramayana, what happens? What is the Ramayana arguing about governance? Basically saying that the rules must be obeyed, contracts and promises must be enforced, even when they're unfair. So clearly in the Ramayana stage of the Iron Age, which is so, the Ramayana is older than the Mahabharata. So from the Vedic age, you have arrived at the stage where the thinking of that time is the law must be enforced, the contracts must be enforced. That is the thinking. And the Ramayana basically makes a case for this. So you see throughout the Ramayana, Ram is forced to enforce contracts and keep promises which are clearly unfair, and they are clearly to his disadvantage. Right? So he's sent away to the forest to enforce a promise that his father gave to one of his stepmothers. Nowhere does the Ramayana try to make a case that it is fair. It is clear it's unfair, but he has to follow it. Throughout the subsequent periods, you keep seeing this happening. And in fact, you see that an entire new section is added to the Ramayana, which is called Uttar Ramayana. This is about what happens to Ram after he returns from Vanvas and begins to rule his kingdom. So remember, this part of the Ramayana is actually not a part of the original Valmiki Ramayana, but is added many centuries later. And in this additional part, so somebody actually added an extra part in which the case is made that as king, Ram had to actually send his wife away, Sita, his beloved wife away, Sita, because the law said so. Again, the Ramayana at no case tries to make the case that this was fair. It is, even in the Ramayana, clearly stated as unfair. But he has to do this. Why does he do this? Because the point being made is that a prosperous kingdom, i.e. Ram Rajya, is based on a system where the ruler also applies the laws to themselves. So this is the case being made. So Ram Rajya is not utopia, right? It is not the kingdom of heaven in, say, the Abrahamic sense. It is not. It is simply a place where the rulers apply the law to themselves, and this leads to prosperity, leads to happiness of the people in general, but it doesn't lead to the happiness of the rulers, mind you. Ram, by the way, lives in utter misery. He misses his wife. He feels guilty about the whole thing. But the point being made is, for the betterment of society, even a great king Ram, why was he great? Because he applied the laws to himself. Now, by the time the Mahabharata comes around, there is obviously a questioning of this line of thought. And so the Mahabharata actually makes the opposite case. So in the Mahabharata, you have a person like Ram, but now it is Yudhishthira. And he too, like Ram, applies the law irrespective of whether it is fair. But unlike in the Ramayana, where it leads to a good outcome, here it ultimately leads to a great war. So the Mahabharata is saying that if you blindly apply the law, irrespective of whether it's a good law or a bad law, then you will end up with the Kurukshetra war. So in the Mahabharata, you have Krishna, who is the avatar of the same God, who twists the law to serve natural justice. The law says that the Kauravas, having won Draupadi in the game of dice, they can disrobe her in public if they wish, because they now own her. Nobody is making the case that it is a good law, but that is what the law is. Now Krishna, however, twists the law. The law is followed in the sense that they're allowed to, the law says they can try and disrobe her. There's no law about the length of the sari. So this repeatedly shows through, even in the war. For example, how Arjun avenges the death of Abhimanyu. Again, the law is followed, but it is twisted by Krishna in a particular way. So you have here a very interesting debate on governance, which has not yet been resolved to this day. The difference between the letter of the law and natural justice, or the spirit of the law. And this is, to this day, an unresolved issue, because both of them, there is a case to be made, and both of them do not necessarily lead to, it's not easy under every circumstances that they will lead to good outcomes. So this is a friction that the Ramayana and Mahabharata clearly bring out about the nature of governance. Now more time passes. Now we are into the late Iron Age, and we are now coming into the edges of the historical age. And now more and more thinkers come. In fact, there are two schools of thought that emerge out of all this thinking, and two schools of two rishis who are actually mentioned in the Mahabharata, Shukra and Brihaspati. But the texts of the Mahabharata do not clarify what the difference between the two schools are. So it is now that we begin to see these schools become much more clear. Now, who are Brihaspati and Shukra? Shukra is the guru of the Asuras, and Brihaspati is the guru of the Devas. Now, it is very important to remember that in the early age, this idea that the Asuras are bad, Devas are good, it doesn't exist. They're just gods and anti-gods. They are in tension with each other, but they are all both important. Both of them are invited to do the Samudra Manthan, for example. So they are opposites, but both of them, by the way, are worshipped in the Vedic period. Varuna, Rudra, all of these are actually Asuras. They are not Devas. It's later that they are converted into Devas because of as thinking evolves in a different direction. So what do these two schools of Shukra and Brihaspati say? Now the problem here is we don't actually have surviving texts from them. There are few surviving texts, the Brihaspati Sutra and the Shukra Niti Sara do exist in very corrupted form to the extent that you cannot actually tell what their original thinking was from those texts. But we can tell from other texts that the Shukra school basically were legalists. They believed in Dandaniti, i.e. the law and the imposition of the law was the basis of enforcement of the law, was the basis of good governance. So the Shukra people would say, government's job is create the law, create good courts, and make sure that the regulators and the courts enforce these laws. That is good governance. The Brihaspati school, however, disagrees with it. They say, yes, you need to do this too, but it is not enough to just have laws. You also need policies. So particularly economic policy, which is called Varta. So this is the difference between the two schools. Now, this is the intellectual context in which Kautilya emerges in the 4th century BC. Now, the reason I told you this long history is so that you understand that Kautilya didn't appear from ether or vacuum, intellectual vacuum. He starts the Kautilya Arthashastra by first giving salutations to both Shukra and to Brihaspati. So this is very interesting. Today we do referencing. Do remember that in the Kautilya Arthashastra, he starts by acknowledging those who came before him. And throughout the text, he mentions other scholars. And sometimes he says he agrees with them, sometimes he disagrees with them. But this idea that Kautilya got up and began to write is not true. He creates a system of referencing where he clearly refers back to these earlier thinkers. And in this Arthashastra, which by the way literally means the treatise on wealth or prosperity or economics, whichever way you want to prefer to call it, he is writing about how to run an idealized kingdom. Now, Kautilya, remember, is not just any old person. He's, of course, when he's putting this together initially, he is a professor at Takshashila University on political economy, and he would go on to create India's first historically attested empire, the Mauryan Empire. So he is one of the co-founders of a major global empire, along with Chandragupta Maurya, who was his student. And so he leaves us this text called the Arthashastra, which is, of course, extraordinary because it is written by a person who is not just a theoretician, but also a major practitioner. And in that text, he leaves us very interesting ideas. Now, unfortunately, Kautilya's Arthashastra, those who don't read it, know it mostly from stories about spies and the mandala theory and so on. But in fact, it is a very small part of his text. Most of his text is on economics and governance. He talks extensively about taxation, about consumer rights, about regulating and encouraging industry. He talks about urban planning, how to design taxation systems, and stuff like this. Almost all of the book is about this. There's a very small section on mandala theory. And so this is what the Arthashastra is about. Now, in the Arthashastra, however, he gives us a very good sense of the intellectual framework right in the first chapter. So what does he say? He says that in order to govern a country, you need to have the 4 areas of knowledge. So he says the first area of knowledge is Dandaniti, which is the rule of law. Second, Varta, which is economic and commercial policy. Then he says you need to also know Anvikshiki, which is the philosophical framework. So he says not good enough to have laws and policy. You need a philosophical framework. Even today, we need a philosophical framework. Are you a capitalist? Are you a socialist? Do you believe in creative destruction and Austrian school? Whatever it is, you need a philosophical framework based on which you run the country. And then finally says, you need to also know Trai, which literally means the 3 Vedas, but more broadly, it means the cultural context. So you need to have the laws and the policies and all this sort of things, but you have to apply them in a certain cultural context. So you also need Trai. Now, what he does is then says, who are the other people who are the various schools? And then it is he who clearly tells us what the different schools of thought think. So he says, the school of Shukra only focuses on Dandini. He says the school of Brihaspati talks about Varta, which is policy, and Dandini, law. Then he says there's the school of Manu. So there is obviously a new school that has got inserted along the way. And he says the school of Manu says, accepts Varta, it accepts Dandini, but then it only thinks that Trai is needed but not Anvikshiki, because it thinks that the cultural context is good enough to tell you the philosophical context. And then he says, Kautilya says finally, that he himself, however, thinks that all 4 are important. Law is important, policy is important, philosophical framework is important, and the cultural context is important, and it is separate from the philosophical context. So this is where the Arthashastra starts, and then of course it goes on to give a long list of policies, etc. But what is he really arguing for? The main thing that comes together very clearly from Kautilya's text that he's a realist, he's not an idealist. And he argues essentially for a strong but limited state. He doesn't state it quite the way I'm stating it, but he argues for a strong but limited state. Now, what does that mean? He basically says that the state has the following limited agenda. It should care about internal and external security and threats. It should administer justice, provide infrastructure and municipal services. It should regulate and encourage commercial and economic activity, and it should collect taxes. Kautilyan state does not allow for any laxity in any of them. He does not have any sense of humor about all of this. But he's very clear what the state does. However, he is not a welfarist. He's suspicious of allowing officials to interfere in daily lives. And he is clear that doing all of this is the secret to avoiding Matsyanya. Now, does the state have a role in providing support? Yes, it does, but only in terms of providing support during emergencies like relief during natural calamities and so on. In general, he does not see the role of the state in doing general welfareism except under these natural calamities and things like that. So he is not a welfarist. He's not an idealist. He is very clearly a realist. And this is the basis on which he runs the state. But why does Kautilya limit the state? Kautilya limits the state because he's extremely suspicious of bureaucrats. So, have this view that Kautilya has all these spy networks and all of this. But it's very clear that these spy networks were either directed towards external threats or towards the officials of the state itself. They're not directed towards general citizens. This is very clear. And the reason for this is that Kautilya limits the Indian state for a reason that is very Indian. So He's not the only philosopher ever to talk about limiting the state. But in the Western philosophical tradition about limiting the state, the usual argument is from the perspective of natural freedoms or natural rights of the individual. That is the reason Western philosophical tradition limits the state. Kautilya, however, has a very Indian reason for limiting the spreading of the state. His reason is corruption. He's extremely suspicious of this, and he says this also. He says, just as it is impossible to know when a fish is drinking water while it is swimming, it is also impossible to find out when a government servant misappropriates money. And then he applies this in various places. So if you see, for example, when he's talking about economic policy, he states, the king shall promote trade and commerce by setting up trade routes by land and by water, as well as market towns and ports. Trade routes shall be kept free from harassment from courtiers, state officials, thieves, and frontier guards, and from damage by herds of cattle. Now, since I'm now a civil servant, let me say, it's rather concerning that one of my heroes, Kautilya, would have put me somewhere between a thief and a herd of cattle. But the general principle is very clear. You must regulate rather than ban various kinds of activities, and the officials must be very tightly controlled and not allowed to interfere with the lives of the average citizen too much. Now 2 generations pass and the Mauryan Empire flourishes. But then it is taken over by a rebel called Ashoka. We all know Ashoka as the Great today, but let me say that he was not just a rebel in terms of how he took over the kingdom, which I'll come to, but in terms of also he actually turns Kautilya's dictum and way of functioning on its head. So that you know who Ashoka was, do remember that Ashoka was actually not the person who was supposed to take over the kingdom. He was actually a usurper who kills all his brothers and took over the kingdom, and in fact he was famous for being extremely cruel. Now this bit is not disputed. What then the usual story goes is that he then invaded Kalinga, and shocked by his own cruelty, he then became a pacifist and a Buddhist. Now many people do not realize this, that this story is entirely made up. There is actually no evidence for him becoming a pacifist ever. There's more than adequate evidence that he was a Buddhist when he invaded Kalinga. 4 years before Kalinga, he had already converted to Buddhism. After invading Kalinga, he did carry out all these massacres, that is attested. But the fact that he became a pacifist is actually not attested anywhere. This is utterly made up 100 years ago by some people who wanted to kind of raise him as being a great kingdom from the past, and proto-socialist, and I will tell you why they thought he would be a good role model. So they just invented this idea of him becoming a pacifist. So usually you will have this passage which you have where he is mentioned that, I've carried out these massacres, but now I have become feeling very sorry about having carried out these massacres in Kalinga, and so on and so forth. Now this paragraph of regret that everybody reads in their textbooks, let me tell you a little bit about it. Note that no edict in Odisha carries this regret. Now if you were so regretful, the one place you would express this regret is in the place where you carried out the massacre. No, this is only mentioned in a edict that is there now in what is now Pakistan. Very far away as possible, in fact, from Odisha. And even there, in the very next paragraph, so you have to know the context in which he says it. He says, notwithstanding the regret I'm feeling towards what I did in Kalinga, if you forest tribes behave badly, I will do the same thing to you. So it is actually a threat. If you don't believe what I'm saying, just go up and read these edicts yourself. It is an exact. So, but I am not here to talk about his pacifism. I am here to talk about his governance. What happens is that Kautilya, as you remember, was essentially thought of his kingdom as a limited law enforcer of the law, a restrained enforcer of the law, and a person who carried out various kinds of policies. He did not want his officials, he was suspicious of his officials, didn't want them to be doing any welfareism, because he generally was of the view that these people will just siphon off the money. But you have here suddenly a completely different view of the role of the state that you have. So in the edicts, you will find Ashoka come up with this idea: all men are my children. And then he literally argues for a welfarist nanny state, and he says, just as parents entrust their child to a wet nurse, the Rajuka officials shall be appointed by me for the welfare and happiness of the people. Now, Kautilya would have been shocked by this statement, because as far as he was concerned, these Rajuka officials were the most suspicious people. Then Ashoka then goes on to state, he gives a large number of these rules which interfere with daily life. And I'll give you another example, which you can also read up yourself. He says on the eighth day of every fortnight, on the 14th and 15th, on the Tissa, on the Purnavasu, the 3 Chaturmasis and other auspicious days, bulls are not to be castrated. Goats, rams, boars and other animals are not to be castrated. On Tissa, Purnavasu and the 4th of Chaturmasi, horses and bullocks are not to be branded. Now again, this is very different from the practical rule making of the Arthashastra. What difference does it make to the bull? The realist Kautilya would have wondered what day of the month that he is castrated. I mean, Kautilya would have just laughed at all of this, saying this is just garbage. What happens as a result of Ashoka's new policies, however, are very real. This first experiment by India on big government ends in absolute disaster. And this is also not debated. Kautilya, the Arthashastra and Kautilya created the empire of the Mauryans. The same empire collapsed while Ashoka was still alive. So we have no idea why he's considered the great, because he usurped the empire he did not create. And while he was still alive, the empire collapsed. We know for a fact that there were large numbers of rebellions all across the country while he was alive. There was a fiscal collapse while he was alive. And while he was alive, his own family began to kill each other as he was lying in his deathbed. His own family began to, in fact, his favorite son was blinded by his favorite wife, and so on and so forth. So it was a pretty sordid end to the Mauryan Empire. And within a few years of Ashoka's death, the empire completely collapsed. So the point I'm making to you is a good warning to all those who believe in fiscal expansion. Now, the ideas of Kautilya are not forgotten despite the collapse of the empire. In fact, perhaps because of the collapse of the empire, he now becomes a legend. So in subsequent empires, Kautilya's Arthashastra is very heavily read, studied, commented upon. And you see this even 600 years later when you have the Gupta Empire arising. They very much try to model themselves on the Mauryan lines. In fact, two of their greatest kings, Chandragupta I and Chandragupta Vikramaditya, named in fact after the Mauryan king Chandragupta. And there are many things there are many plays, for example, Mudra Rakshas, etc., which are about the Mauryans. So the imperial Guptas are fascinated by the imperial Mauryas, not surprisingly. So it's not surprising that their thinkers also remembered Kautilya and Chanakya and so on. And you have a text from this period called Kamandat's Niti Sara, which talks about many of these ideas. So he, again, very interestingly, since I talked about referencing, he begins the text by referencing Brihaspati, Shukra, and now, since he's now the legend, Vishnugupta Chanakya as the people from which he's got his ideas. So, and many of these ideas now he push forward. But it's also interesting that there are some small differences. Now remember, Kautilya is the founder of an empire. Niti Sara is written at the time when the Gupta Empire is already well established. So Kamandok is writing for an audience which is of an established empire, not an empire that is just being created or to be created. So it's quite interesting how that changes perspective. So Kautilya was very open to getting new talent in. Whereas you can clearly see subliminally Kamandaka has this preference for aristocrats. So he is obviously we don't know exactly who was, but it's likely he was a scholar or a minister in an established system. So you can clearly see the elite is already trying to establish itself. So there are these small differences, but nonetheless, many of the basic ideas of the Kautilya are continued. Now we are reaching the medieval period, and here you begin to see by the 10th, 11th century, many of Kautilya's ideas are there, but you can also see a certain fossilization of our thinking. And you see that in Somadeva's Niti, Vyakyam, Mritam, Bhoja's Yukti, Niti Sara. They're simply not of the same caliber as Kautilya. There is a lot of statements here, but we are already going back to the old aphorism style rather than clinical thinking. So, for example, Somdeva, which is a Jain text, by the way, from the 10th century, he says, a minister who is spendthrift and generates little revenue eats away the wealth of the king. Now, I agree, this is probably a statement about fiscal rectitude, but point I'm making is that it's very different from the systematic thinking of Kautilya's Arthashastra. It is a series of dictums rather than systematic framework of thought. So you already can see that I've kind of wavered away. And of course, after this, what happens is that the old civilization goes through this major shock of the Turkic invasions, and the great universities of Nalanda and so on are burnt down. Takshila, of course, was burnt down earlier in the 4th century, and so on. And so there is this big shock to the system. But I'm sure there were new ideas, texts, etc. written. Unfortunately, we do not know what many of these texts from this period actually say, because not enough research has been done. And this is something that young scholars here should really take upon themselves. There are 4 lakh manuscripts lying untranslated in the National Manuscript Mission. I'm quite certain there are many texts in there about governance, but nobody is paying serious attention to them. Unfortunately, it is one of the bizarre things is that this effort to go out there and translate ancient medieval texts actually declines after independence. There were actually a greater effort happening towards translating these texts and taking them more seriously in the pre-independence period, not just in the princely states, but even in British-controlled India. And after independence, we seem to have lost all interest in this. So one of the ideas behind conferences like this is to get young scholars to go out there. There's a huge piles of material. You can make your careers out of them. There's so much material out there that you can go out and dig for. There is also texts, by the way, from the Mughal period, which come, like Abul Fazl, Aini, Akbari, and so on. But again, we have this problem here that it doesn't delve into the principles of governance. It gives you long lists about how the structure of governance works. So it tells you about the, Aini Akbari has all kinds of things, information about customs of the time, history, levels of government, wages of laborers, even the cost of house building it has. So it's quite a rich text. But somebody will have to really sit in there and dig out what are the principles of governance, because it doesn't, unlike the Arthashastra, it does not lay out the principles of governance. I'm quite certain, like I have done for the Mahabharata and Ramayana, somebody reading through it could probably glean it out, but this is work that somebody needs to do. Now we end up here in the colonial period. And here there is an interesting text that is written on the principles of government by a remarkable person called Raja Madhav Rao. Now, Raja Madhav Rao he gave a set of lectures in 1881 to Sayaji Rao Gaikwad III, who was the young Maharaja of Baroda, whose Prime Minister Madhav Rao was. So you had this young prince, so he gave these lectures, and these lectures are called Hints on the Art and Science of Government. There is a very good translation recently available. So you can, by somebody called Rahul Sagar, so you can pick up that translation on, it's a recent one, I think published in 2022. So you can pick it up and you'll read through them, but it's quite interesting to read through it. Because in there, you can clearly see many of these old ideas going back all the way to the Iron Age are still alive. There's still the idea of Raj Dharma, of Matsya Nyaya and so on. But at the same time, times have changed. So the application of these ideas have now to be done in a different context, because Sayaji Gaikwad is under a situation where he has limited sovereignty. He's functioning under British colonial overlordship. So this is the times have changed. Also, times have changed because unlike in the past where there was a judicial system, but the king was the ultimate top of the system in a sense. So it wasn't entirely independent in that sense. And both almost all the ancient schools of thought basically thought of the king as being a restrained enforcer of the law. But now that you have a judicial system that is the enforcer of the law, the role of the king has changed. And so Madhav Rao states this, as you can see, because a legal system, modern judicial system is being created. So he now states how the young prince to think about this. So he says, now that we have succeeded in establishing in these territories a series of judicial tribunals such as the country requires, the judicial tribunals have been working well and fulfilling their objectives. So let me inform your highness of the clear result of my study and experience, namely that any Maharaja who undertakes to administer public justice personally must inevitably fail. So you can see, you have here the old traditions coming at one side, but at the same time, modernity has crept in. The idea of separation of the judiciary to becoming independent has come, and he's warning the prince that please do not try to administer justice on your own. So now that Dandaniti is no longer in the hand of the prince, what is his role in the princely state? So then the focus clearly shifts to Varta, i.e. policy. And therefore, you can see Baroda state then goes and focuses on public works, infrastructure, commerce, industry, education, and so on. And a lot of this hard work meant that Baroda would become one of the most prosperous states. And even today, the part of Gujarat which was Baroda is clearly one of the most industrialized places in the whole country. So I'm now giving you a very long range history going back to the epics and even before the epics to all the way to the 19th century. The idea here was to give you a flavor of the huge amount of thought and thinking that has gone on over thousands of years into the art of governance and the principles of governance as opposed to the form of government. And this entire area of work, unfortunately, is very ill served. As I said, a little bit of work is there on the Arthashastra. People like to pull out random quotes from Arthashastra and quote them here and there, but nobody thinks about it as a part of a wider set of intellectual tradition that has existed for a very, very long time. And the purpose of my coming here and giving this lecture is the hope that I can get young scholars and professors, and older scholars and professors as well, to go out there and mine this very, very rich pool of intellectual thought, and some of it to understand our past, but I'm sure there is lots in there that can be even applied today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.